You're listening to the Pithy Chronicle. History with a bite. I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica. And we bring you history's dirtiest deeds, dripping with sarcasm.
Are you hungry yet?
Hey there, Pithy listeners, and welcome back for part 2 of the life and legacy of Catherine de' Medici. Last week we heard as Catherine's childhood was destroyed by anti-Medici Florentines, and we heard how her uncle, the Pope, gave her in marriage to the noblest bidder. We discussed her difficult marriage as she watched the man that she truly loved love another, and we sympathized with her fertility problems as she spent the first decade of her marriage barren and desperate. But once the floodgates opened, thanks to a very involved doctor who left behind no useful notes, she welcomed 10 children in quick succession.
Finally, we learned of her husband's death from a gruesome jousting accident.
Gruesome.
And this is where we will pick up today.
Yay!
Yay?
Yes, yay, because widowhood is when she shines. Before this, she's been a pawn.
It is
in
true.
This episode, she is her own...
She is an agent of her own destiny.
That is lovely, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Catherine, as we said, is now a widow, and her 16-year-old son, Francis II, is king. And before long, France will be at war with itself.
But before we dive in, a tiny bit of housekeeping. First, we would like to thank our lovely patrons on Patreon. We are really grateful for your continued support, and if you too would like to support the Pithy Chronicle and our dream of providing scandalous history each and every week, you can donate as little as $1 a month. Likes, reviews, follows, and subscriptions are also wonderful ways that you can keep these chroniclers busy, besides our 3 toddlers put together, and those are free.
Because God knows the toddlers aren't.
No, God, they're so expensive.
They're so expensive. But despite our toddlers' precociousness and expensiveness, we have some fun things planned for the summer and the fall, so you will not want to miss out.
And now, vive la France! Oh, P.S. If you haven't listened to the first half, you really should, because it's not going to work out the other way around.
Yeah, probably important.
After Henry's death, Catherine was devastated for many reasons. First, her beloved husband had just died. Second, her son Francis was in terrible health.
Even though Rain says otherwise.
Yeah, Rain is full of shit.
Is it great and soapy? Yes.
Yes.
But also terrible.
The woman who plays Catherine de' Medici,
Megan Follows.
love her because of Anne of Green Gables.
Yeah, she was the OG Anne of Green Gables.
And she was fantastic. I fell in love with her.
I even thought she was fantastic as Catherine.
I did too. I just think she's wonderful in every way. Mary is a different story.
Oh, you didn't like Adelaide Kane?
I mean, she's stunning. I'm not sure she's Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah, I don't know that she's Mary Queen of Scots, but
I think she was hampered.
The eyebrow game.
The eyebrow game was excellent. I mean, the Kardashians need to up their work.
Everyone needs to up their ante to Adelaide Kane.
But it's wrong.
It is
Everything
wrong.
about her character is wrong. That is not who it's all wrong. So don't listen to Rain. So despite what Rain says, her son Francis was in terrible health from the get-go. And everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before he died as well. And then the third thing that was really driving Catherine's anxiety up was that she wasn't quite sure what her new role should be as a dowager queen. Usually, Catherine would have entered confinement at this point to mourn her husband.
Boo!
Boo. And I think she honestly, out of many queens, she probably could have used it.
Yeah,
she was
fine.
in love, and she was devastated.
But also, he's such a poot head.
He's a poot head, and I hope everyone heard that. A poot head. But she didn't get it. Because with the state financially exhausted by the Italian wars that had ruined both her childhood and that of Henry II's, Catherine could not leave it all to Francis because he was just super sick. I can't stress this enough. And he wasn't really ruling alone. Despite being of age, his health was so frail that everyone, including Catherine, thought it best to have some backup. She was not regent at this time, as is often misrepresented, but Instead, he had a group of nobles that were his council, basically. In fact, he was so weak that this group of council, these nobles, actually had to stand on either side of him to hold up the crown during coronation day. Because he was so weak, he couldn't physically hold his head up with this heavy weight on top of it.
God.
Francis's power was delegated pretty quickly to his wife's uncles. We haven't talked a ton about Mary, Queen of Scots. Mostly because Erica is going to take us down that rabbit hole next week.
So excited!
She's doing a dance. But she had married the ailing Francis just a year before his ascension to the throne. And her mother was from the powerful Guise family. And therefore, her uncles took on a very active role in Francis's administration. And honestly, Catherine agreed to a lot of this. Catherine was still in mourning, and she had raised Mary from a very young age.
5, I think.
So we'll get there next week. But all this to say, she basically decided that widowhood would be the way that she claimed Henry as her own, and she took this very seriously. She had shared her husband her entire married life with actually a lot of women, but none had the power over him that Diane de Poitiers did. But widowhood, Catherine decided, was reserved for her alone. I know, and she deserves it. She worked hard.
That's right. Listen, she suffered.
She put those poultices of urine and ground up corn on her
hoo-ha.
Yes. So she wore black for the rest of her life, like a badge of honor. And she quickly helped Diane out the door, out of her favorite castle that Henry had given Diane anyway, and out of power and influence. Actually, I want to point out that Catherine could have been significantly harsher. Other royal mistresses at other points in history suffered greatly after their protector died, but Catherine understood diplomacy, and that's an important thing to remember for this episode. She was a very good diplomat, and she knew that burning bridges led to serious problems. So instead, she showed restraint. Diane was allowed to live out her life in comfortable obscurity.
Which honestly must have been tough for Diane, but
could have been worse.
Could have been worse.
Had Francis been healthy and involved, Catherine's life would have been completely different. But he wasn't. After only 17 months on the throne, again, Rain loves to play havoc with the dates, Francis II died from some sort of an unknown ear condition. No one is quite sure what the illness was, and we will discuss her children's continual health issues toward the end of this episode. But suffice to say that the boy died an excruciating death, and Catherine could do nothing but watch.
Jeez.
It was bad. It was really bad. And upon the death of her first son, she saw her second son, Charles, take the throne at just 10 years old. Too young this time to rule alone. So Catherine was forced back into the thick of things as his regent. And I know some people will scoff at the word forced, but I don't think that anyone wants their 10-year-old to have the weight of France on his shoulders, especially after the death of their first
Poorly
child.
developed shoulders.
Poorly developed and ill, as we'll find out.
Yeah.
For the next 3 years, she struggled really just to keep the throne safe for her young son, because France was basically imploding. Religion was a huge part of 16th century life. There was no separation of church and state, but that became very problematic when the French population became increasingly Protestant, not Catholic, like the state, like the crown, like the monarchy, like Catherine. I'm not going to delve into the nitty-gritty between Protestantism and Catholicism, but Protestantism was an idea that had formed early in the 16th century, and it was spreading fast. There were a lot of people who didn't love the papacy, and I think we can all understand why, especially around this time when it was very much bought and sold. And beyond that, many were attracted to the more personal religious experience of Protestantism. In France, Protestants were called Huguenots. I want to make clear that the death of Henry II, and to a smaller extent his son Francis II, did not cause the 9 wars of religion to come.
Jesus.
Right? 9. But they left a power vacuum that widow and mother Catherine was unable to control. Partly, and this will shock many listeners, because of Catherine's moderate nature.
Yet moderate is not a word that I would necessarily associate with her, given any of the media portrayals that I've seen.
No, and I wouldn't have either, but I read a 400-page biography on her and listened to many podcasts about her.
Oh my gosh.
I really did my research because I was surprised by this representation of her. But I'm gonna stick by it. Moderate.
I love it. I can't wait. Convince me.
Ooh, challenge accepted. History has been beyond cruel to Catherine, except for Meg Follows, because she's amazing, and Catherine would have wished to be as stunning as that woman is, because Catherine was not a beauty. But history has been very cruel to Catherine, labeling her the wicked Italian queen. And we will touch on why this happened and how she handled it a bit later. But suffice to say, she wasn't radical. She wasn't dogmatic. She just wanted everyone to get along and let her son continue to rule France. But no one was willing to let things go. Basically, while land, power, and money could all be debated and frankly decided on the battlefield or at least on the negotiating table, religion could not.
Yeah, when you tell someone, hey, you don't have to pay for the sale of indulgences, it's a game changer.
It is. The clash of ideological absolutes did not allow for diplomacy. And frankly, we can still see this today. There's no changing someone's mind about the religion that they believe in strongly. At the birth of Protestantism, a lot of moderates hoped that the schism could eventually be corrected and that everybody would just come back together. But as we still have Protestantism and Catholicism today, it's clear that that's never going to happen. But Catherine, without the use of a crystal ball, though the woman did love a good prophecy, and we will get into that as well, she had no way of knowing that Christianity was forevermore split. She didn't have the religious background, as we discussed last week, to conquer the spiritual and doctrinal divide. She only had diplomacy, and she was actually very adept at it. During her time as regent, and beyond, because she still had quite a bit of influence after Charles came of age, diplomacy during Catherine's time increased. The number of ambassadors nearly doubled. She maintained embassies throughout Europe with both Catholic and Protestant nations, and she tried to use her children's marriages as peace treaties between these two sides. Whether or not they worked is a different question, but she tried. However, she could not bring the two sides of Christianity together, and the world around her couldn't either. Elizabeth I of England ascended to her Protestant throne in 1558, months before Henry II died. The world looked completely different all of a sudden. And I think that's an important backdrop. I know that feels kind of like extra information, but she's coming to this brand new world, two religions, for the first time in Europe in centuries.
Think about when the first Great Schism happened between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. That was,
huge.
1054. The break of communion between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches.
So 500 years earlier. It was a huge deal, and it was very upsetting to people whose entire life at this point revolved around religion and what was going to happen to them next, because life, frankly, was not all that exciting here on Earth at that point. It was real tough to be a peasant. Throughout the second half of the 16th century, which constitutes the 30 years of Catherine's influence as Dowager Queen, Regent, and then advisor to not one, but eventually 3 kings of France, all of which were her sons, diplomacy and its power declined because the ideological issues, or the differences between Catholic and Protestant, divided Europe into 2 camps more bitterly irreconcilable and more firmly aligned than any other division in European history. And France became the battleground.
Gosh, can't you see why?
The French Wars of Religion began in 1562, 2 years after Francis II had died and his younger brother Charles IX succeeded him. And they lasted until 1598, 36 years. During that time, somewhere between 2 and 4 million people lost their lives due to violence, famine, or disease directly caused by this religious conflict. And the fighting finally ended only when Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism for the second time in 1593 and was proclaimed Henry IV of France. But I'm really getting ahead of myself. That is not her Henry. It's a different Henry. We'll get to him. So let's talk about the sides. The Catholic faction was led by the powerful Guise and Montmorency families, with additional support from Spain and the papacy, because, duh. The Guise family had enjoyed a lot of power during that 17-month reign of Francis II and his wife Mary, whose mother was again a Guise. But with Francis's death, their place at court was, less secure now, and Mary was shipped back to Scotland. The Protestant faction was headed by the House of Condé and Jean d'Albert, with additional support from Protestant England and the Dutch Republic. Moderates, like Catherine, attempted to maintain order by centralizing power, meaning everything's about the king, and making small concessions to the Huguenots. In 1562, Catherine, as regent, approved the Edict of Saint-Germain. This was a landmark decree. It allowed for limited tolerance of Huguenots in Catholic France. You can practice it, please don't make a big deal out of it, just keep it on the DL.
Like when Elizabeth said, I don't want a window into your soul.
You do you, just don't tell me. But the Guise family was very much opposed to this new edict, and their hatred led to the outbreak of fighting just 2 months after the edict was made. In fact, it began just 5 days before, technically, the edict took effect.
So this is the massacre of Vassy.
Exactly. The Duke of Guise, the one who'd had all this power for those 17 months when Francis was quote-unquote king, he was urged on by his mother, who was seriously devout and a little crazy.
And also a princess of the blood.
Yeah, the Guises were super important. So the Duke of Guise, urged on by his kind of crazy mother, just happened to be walking around his vast property, visiting the Catholic Church on a Sunday when someone told him there was a Protestant service happening pretty nearby. And while this would be legal in 5 days, it wasn't yet technically. So along with a priest and a provost, the Duke went to the barn that he'd heard 500 Protestants were worshiping, and he listened as they sang the Psalms. He and his Catholic minions then tried to enter the barn/church, but were resisted at the door. And that's when the killing began. The Duke was either unable or unwilling to stop the violence. Many worshippers escaped through a hole in the roof, but that wasn't a problem because the Duke's sharpshooters just picked them off as they fled through the field. In total, 50 people died, including 5 women and 1 child. News of this massacre spread like wildfire, and no one knew for certain how the violence began. The Duke of Guise insisted that the Protestants, while at worship, fired arquebuses from inside the barn at his men, who then were just defending themselves. Don't be judgy. The Huguenots refuted this claim, saying that they were at church when the Duke of Guise and his men burst in and just started murdering innocents. The massacre, therefore, only inspired further violence. Just 1 month later, the people of Sens massacred more than 100 Huguenots in their own town, throwing their corpses into the Seine.
Oh my gosh.
Catherine now had to act. She told the Duke of Guise to report to court immediately at Fontainebleau, her favorite castle. And he went, instead, to Paris, receiving a hero's welcome by all his Parisian Catholic supporters. Catherine again tried to use the will of the king, the 12-year-old king, and ordered both factions headed by the Duke of Guise and the Prince of Condé, who was a Protestant, to leave Paris. And this time, Guise just outright refused. And the Prince of Condé decided to take action and marched onto the city of Orléans, seizing it and releasing his manifesto justifying his rebellion. And I do like that he included a manifesto.
I mean, cite your sources, man. Good for you.
Exactly. He cited the, quote, cruel and horrible carnage wrought at Versailles in the presence of Monsieur de Guise. And he's not wrong.
He's not wrong.
Then things just got worse. The Prince of Condé was captured, Guise was assassinated, until finally Catherine, as regent to again a 12-year-old, was able to mediate a truce with a second edict of Amboise a year after the violence began. This ended the first of the 9 wars of religion, and it led to 4 years of armed peace.
An armed peace does not sound like peace.
It doesn't, does it? Really, no. No one really liked this Edict of Amboise. And while Catherine continued to attempt to bring both sides to the negotiating table, neither party would budge. Eventually, Charles was declared of age at only 13, which was a year before he really was of legal age, in the hopes of uniting France behind their monarch. It didn't work. King Charles IX and his mother went on a 2-year grand tour of the kingdom, attempting to reinstate the crown's authority. But really, this period of peace was just entrenchment on both sides, each preparing for the inevitable, next, and certainly not final, battle. I am not going to go into all 9 wars specifically, because they were all really part of the same larger conflict. But everything came to a head 10 years later, in 1572. It was meant to be a joyous time. Catherine, and King Charles, of course, had arranged a royal wedding between Margaret of Valois, her daughter, and Henry of Navarre, the son of Jean d'Albert, the very staunch Protestant. He was the ruler of Navarre, which was the Protestant stronghold in France, and he is the one that will end the wars 26 years later-ish. Catherine hoped this would reconcile both sides. Catherine was wrong. But it had been known to work before. The wedding was in August. There were 2 ceremonies, and the couple both had stand-ins for the opposite religion's ceremony, so neither would have to take vows against their own religious beliefs. It was quite a juggling act.
That's the weirdest marriage by proxy I've ever heard of.
Because they were in the same city. Everybody was there, but they couldn't be together at the altar. It was really weird. And all the most powerful Huguenot aristocracy came to Paris for the occasion.
Oh, this sounds like a dun-dun-dun moment.
Yeah. One wonders if they really thought all this through. Anywho, a few days after the wedding, Admiral Coligny, who was the leader of Huguenot forces after the Prince of Condé died in battle a few years earlier, he was shot while he was out for a morning stroll. Luckily, he bent down just as the bullet left the chamber, and while the shot tore a finger from his hand and shattered his elbow, he survived.
That's a weird angle to get, but okay.
I think it went through the elbow and into the finger. I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
No one made an AI
Crime
reenactment.
scene.
King Charles sent his personal physician to attend Admiral Coligny because they were great friends, which is kind of a sticky point. Coligny was a personal advisor to the king, and his influence, though Protestant, was great. And Charles really looked at him like a father figure.
So it was Charles and not Catherine. He was actually friends with Charles, not Catherine.
He was not friends with Catherine.
Okay, just wanted the clarity there.
Therefore, who ordered his attempted assassination? No one knows for sure. Was it Catherine? Was she jealous of his influence with the king? But, she really just wanted peace, and she just created this wedding for that purpose. So maybe it was the Guise family as part of their decade-long vendetta. Others have argued it was Spain.
It's always Spain.
Or the Duke of Anjou. Or Parliament. So many choices. No one knows for certain because the investigation was stalled when events escalated.
Ooh, escalated.
Escalated.
That's quite a word for
The
it.
Huguenots were pissed. How dare someone try to murder their leader? They wanted justice, and the king promised they would get it. Because he too was pretty furious about this attempted assassination of his dear friend and advisor. But that promise was problematic, as Catherine well knew.
Because he was taking the opposite side that he was supposed to.
Well, he was taking a side.
Wow.
And remember, they were moderate.
He was supposed to stay moderate, even though he was Catholic.
He was. And he was very, very friendly with Coligny.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholics also were now very fearful of retaliation from the angry Huguenots, who had brought more than 4,000 troops with them for this wedding. Just in case. The day after his assassination attempt, 3 council meetings were held in quick succession, in which it was decided to preemptively assassinate the Huguenot leaders before they could retaliate against the Catholics for the assassination against the Huguenot leader.
That circular reasoning makes no sense to me.
No, this was a bad plan. And there were 3 different meetings.
It was a bad choice.
No one said this isn't good because, unfortunately, it was a unanimous decision to do this. How the idea originated or who first proposed all of these murders is unknown, but consent among the council, including Catherine and the king, was unanimous.
This is the stupidest idea I've ever freaking heard.
The king yesterday is horrified that his friend has almost been murdered. And today he's like, all right, we got to take out all the leaders of the Huguenots just in case. So the Catholic leaders headed kill squads. That's what they were called, kill squads, that were formed before dawn the following morning. Guise led one, killing Coligny, finally, and leaving his body on the streets of Paris where it was mutilated by Catholics.
God.
Other kill squads were assigned to various other Huguenot nobles, to include Henry of Navarre, the groom, who was actually found in his wedding bed with his new bride.
Oh.
And then the Prince of Condé, the new Prince of Condé because his dad had been killed, both of whom were unharmed, but forced to convert to Catholicism, which they repudiated the moment they got out of Paris. So that didn't work very well.
Mm-hmm.
By dawn, the official killings were over. The Huguenot leaders were wiped out.
Well, what about the unofficial killing?
They just didn't stop. For months. Months. Soon, assassinations turned into a massacre. Over the next 5 days, violence continued as Catholics across Paris murdered any Huguenot they could find. Historians estimate that about 2,000 Huguenots were killed in Paris in those few days, and thousands more died in the provinces. Up to 10,000 people. Although Huguenot estimates or Protestant estimates say something like 70,000, but I think 10 is probably closer to the truth because Catholics say just like 500. So
Meet in the middle.
But not all the deaths were religious based. Many people decided to take advantage of the chaos and take care of those annoying neighbors, business rivals, nagging wives.
Wow. It's like the Purge.
The Purge. Needless to say, the massacre provoked horror and outrage among Protestants throughout Europe, while Catholic nations like Spain celebrated.
Wow. Spain, you are just so terrible right now.
Spain never looks good when it comes to religion.
No, they don't do themselves any favors.
No, they really don't. In a very large nutshell, this was the wars of religion. They continued long after what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre.
Especially because it lasted longer than a day.
Because it lasted for months. And they even continued until after Catherine's death, beyond the scope of this episode. But this one day of violence, or one massacre, because it wasn't just a day, as we said, it really could not be contained. And that represented the continual burning passions of both sides and the refusal of either camp to negotiate or compromise. It was Catholicism or death, Protestantism or death. There was nothing else.
Wow.
And then there's Catherine de Medici, who was left holding the bloody proverbial dagger. Due to her moderate nature, although again, yes, she did order the killings of the Huguenot leaders, neither the Catholics nor the Protestants trusted her. And due to her Italian paternity, the French people in general placed all of the blame squarely on her aging shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to trace her treacherous reputation as it grows throughout the centuries after her death, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when the French turned on her. But most historians agree it was likely the Protestant pamphlets that blamed Catherine for the entire St. Bartholomew's Day massacre as cementing her infamy as cruel and calculating.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until the early 19th century that her legend of wickedness reached its zenith.
God, the Victorians.
They hated women rulers despite Victoria.
The Victorians were the social equivalent of the medieval church. They just ruined everything they touched.
They were like, you people are all terrible and sinning and dying in hell. For more than 300 years after her death, Catherine's reputation continued to grow, to expand, and to spiral downward toward evil. At the time the pamphlets came out, Catherine read them and ignored them. It's actually said that she found them so outlandish and ridiculous that she laughed at them because she thought, who could possibly believe this crap?
The Victorians!
The Victorians! They found found the tabloid rags of centuries earlier and were like, see, women are evil. During her life, she was referred to as ambitious and occasionally compared with Machiavelli, also of Italian
Which would
descent.
have been very recent in the zeitgeist.
Very contemporary. So all that makes sense. But it was her gender that really posed the most problems. Women who wanted power were seen as witches, as evil, as going against the very nature of their sex. And thus her determination to protect her children, to protect the French crown, to protect her husband's line, it was all seen as bad rather than maternal or even queenly.
Even though those were the tenets of queenship.
Yeah. But the other tenet of queenship is that you had to uphold religion and be this pious representative. And because she was moderate, she didn't uphold Catholicism or Protestantism enough. She pissed off everybody.
She wasn't zealous enough.
It was only after her death that her legacy became morphed through legend. Legend that had very little to do with fact. Catherine was desperate to conceive, as we talked about last time. She put gross poultices on her source of life. She consulted astrologers in times of crisis, desperate for happy tidings of her son's futures because they weren't looking good because they were really sick all the time. And both of these were very normal practices for women of the French court at the time. But those facts eventually, over centuries, led to accusations of poisonings and murders. And I mean, many had kind of started to wonder how the former Dauphin, Francis, had died at 18 in seemingly good health, leaving the throne to his brother and Catherine's husband. But at the time, it was the Little Whisper campaign. It wasn't until, as we said, the Victorians got a hold of it that things really got crazy. And of course, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which started as a terrible happening in the Wars of Religion, became a murderous plot by Catherine, who they said had used her own daughter as bait to lure unsuspecting and innocent Protestants to their death.
So, while all of this is fascinating, and I really am enjoying this, I want to talk, I'm as bad as the Victorians, I want to talk about the salacious, the prolific, allegedly, poisonings. Tell me more about that.
I understand that. I get it. That's what I wanted to know too. And that is why I did extra research, just to make sure I wasn't going to lose that aspect of Catherine. Catherine today, or historically, is not only accused of being a prolific poisoner, which the French argued was because of her Italian blood, but she also allegedly had an entire apothecary cabinet containing 237 drawers, each filled with poisons for every occasion. And I see your smile. You look so excited about her murderous intent.
Any cabinet with that much storage, I need in my house.
Agreed! I want one of those too. I would not put poison in it, but that's not the point.
Yeah, it sounds nefarious though, so like...
It does, it really does.
Keep going.
And so too thought Alexandre Dumas, the very famous 19th century French novelist who wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, and a little-known work called Queen Margot, published in 1845. And this is the story of a queen, a lot like Catherine, who had a wall of poisons, who cursed her enemies and poisoned her foes. It had just enough basis in fact to make everyone believe that it was a work of nonfiction, cementing this poor woman's posthumous fate as the wicked Italian queen, despite living most of her life in and for France. But back to the poison. Okay, so Catherine is perhaps most notorious for...
the poison gloves and the poison rings.
So exciting! But no. Like everything else, it has been exaggerated. I hate to be this person. I don't like busting fun myths. The Italians, when Catherine moved to France, were noted for their perfumes. Everybody smelled bad. It was a bad time to have a nose. Everybody reeked. And perfumes helped to reel in said reek. And therefore, perfumed gloves became quite popular in Italy. And that is something that Catherine brought to France. Perfume gloves are not like just a glove with a little bit of spritz on them. No. These things were made from scratch, infused with oil, herbs, and animal fat, and other scents from the get-go. They really smelled great, which sounds awesome. I want a pair.
Yeah.
These perfume gloves are called sweet gloves, which just sounds so nice.
That does sound nice.
It sounds so innocent. Catherine brought them from France. The fashion exploded. Everybody wanted really yummy smelling hands. And she also gave them out as gifts. Most notably, she sent a pair to Jean d'Albert, 2 months before Jean's son, Henry of Navarre, was to marry Catherine's daughter, Margaret.
Which, of course, then led to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Exactly. So Catherine sent these gloves 2 months before that as a token of affection and loyalty, which is the glove's traditional meaning. So it was a really thoughtful and well-intentioned gift. The two women notoriously did not get along. And so many historians now, not the Victorian historians, they say something different, but the modern historians say that they think Catherine was at least trying to offer an olive branch before this big day. Unfortunately, Jean died soon after receiving them.
Oh dear, that's suspect.
Before the wedding, but after receiving the gloves. It doesn't look good. But it's actually pretty well established in historical fact that Jean died of tuberculosis, which, if you know anything about TB, it's pretty obvious. Yeah. You're coughing up blood. It's very specific. So not the poisoned sweet gloves. And at the time, her death wasn't questioned at all. It was only decades, even centuries later, when anti-Catherine, and some could read that as anti-female historians, connected the dots and gave what was a thoughtful and personal gift a malicious and deadly intent. Among the many other victims that Catherine is accused of poisoning, most, if frankly not all of them, have been historically debunked.
So did she actually poison anyone?
Maybe. I mean, she certainly was strong-willed, and she lived in a masculine world of intrigue and violence, but no, there's really no proof that she murdered anyone or that she poisoned anyone. In fact, there's not even a lot of circumstantial evidence to support it. Mostly, it's prejudice against a female ruler. And she wasn't even a ruler. She was an advisor at this point.
No body, no crime, right?
Maybe she's just really good at covering it up.
Maybe she's better than they ever thought.
And that's possible. I don't want to poo-poo that she never killed anybody. I'm sure she had someone killed. Many people probably, but likely not through poisoned sweet gloves.
So, okay, there are plenty of other malicious and nefarious accusations, like the prophecies, her hanging out with Nostradamus. She's known as the Serpent Queen. Come on, give me some more.
Okay, yes. Many of those things are true. Catherine did have a very large interest in science. For instance, she was greatly concerned with astrology.
Astrology or astronomy?
They were basically one and the same at this point in time. And my father is an astronomer, so I promise I'm not confusing them. I'm telling you that at this moment in time, 6 1/2 dozen of the other. Most astronomers of the 16th century believed that the future could be predicted by planetary movement and the collections of the stars, and that was the science of astrology. Today, not so much. We have better math. But Catherine was up to date with these latest scientific, astrologic theories, and she did believe in reading the stars. She had a lot at stake. She had a lot on her mind. She looked to astrology as a way to guide her fears and help her cope. I think a lot of people still look at their horoscopes, not necessarily because they believe in astrology, but because it just makes them feel better as they walk out the door that day.
Yeah, understanding yourself a little bit more.
Self-reflection. But she was not alone. Almost everyone at this time believed in astrology. It was popular with the court. It was not suspicious in the least, not until hundreds of years later. She also, as you said, had prophecies. She had dreams. One of the most specific ones was the night before Henry's death at this fatal joust. She saw her husband covered in blood, fallen from his horse.
And that seems pretty credible, right?
It does. It absolutely seems sad.
Right.
Possibly revisionist.
Oh.
You know, she talked about having seen it after the fact, but she maybe just had a nightmare because she didn't want him to joust. She was afraid for him to joust. He had vertigo.
Oh, God.
Not a great thing when you're jousting.
No.
He was
That's
not in great health.
God, what an idiot.
Just because someone's nightmare comes true doesn't necessarily mean that they're evil and that they willed it.
Or that they even have prophetic visions.
Or that. She didn't want him to die. This was not a good time.
No.
Francis really wasn't going to make it. All of this was bad.
Okay, fine. But what about Nostradamus?
Nostradamus. She did consult with the infamous Nostradamus. They were contemporaries. But again, he wasn't scary or feared or evil at this time. He was a scientist of sorts, if somewhat unorthodox. And he was known to have prophecies, which were common and accepted at the time. He even published a book, The Prophecies, which she read and thought, come and read my son's futures.
Sure.
So, yes, you're right. She did absolutely ask him to court and to draw horoscopes for her children. Centuries later, we hear that he accurately predicted how many years each of her 3 sons would spend on the throne. 1 for Francis, 13 for Charles, and 15 for Henry. But there are no records of such prophecies at the time. This was all created afterward to kind of wrap it up in a pretty little bow. Or an evil little bow.
Huh. So do we have any of Nostradamus's contemporary from him prophecies?
Yeah, you can read his book, The Prophecies. It's a big book, and it was very widely published.
I just didn't know if those were more revisionist.
So those were published really before Catherine consulted him. So
okay.
Not about the French court. Once he got to the French court, no. Nothing that he said has been published that I know of about the kings or about Catherine's family in general. It's more that he wrote this really famous book. People thought he had the eye.
A gift.
Having this gift was a common belief at the time. It was all based on astrology, which was a
man,
science.
so he's not a witch.
Exactly. She did call him down and ask him for some help, and he said something to her.
Sure.
But if you were Nostradamus, would you have told her that her son would only live for 1 year?
Absolutely not.
That's suicidal.
Yep.
Likely he didn't say that, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
After the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, Catherine would live for another 17 years, acting as advisor to Charles IX until his death, when her 3rd and favorite son, Henry, then took the throne. And as her health faded, so too did her influence. But she was always there, always pushing her sons to be better, because none of them were great, and to do more, and to take their responsibilities seriously. Someone has to actually rule France. It sounds like pretty much every dowager queen ever.
Yeah.
We see that with mothers that are given this huge burden to protect their son, keep him alive, keep him in power up until he takes the actual crown in his own damn hands, and then he just has sex, spends money, and starts wars.
Pisses it away.
Catherine had, I think, a very sad life, and it's unfortunate that history has given her such an evil reputation, because the woman suffered enough in life.
Yeah.
She didn't need to do it in death. Orphaned at 21 days, singled out for execution at 12, and in really gross ways. Married off to a stranger at 14, never truly loved by her husband, infertile for more than a decade and blamed for it completely, only then to bear 10 children and some seriously grotesque births, 7 of which survived to adulthood and only 2 of which outlived her.
That just seems, even for the time, especially unlucky.
Mm-hmm.
Or was there something medically that we could blame? Oh, I'm getting a
It was unusual. 2 out of 10 is not good.
It's not a good ratio.
And it was definitely incredibly painful, and her children's continual ill health was one of her biggest worries, and it led to a lot of this astrological research that has ended up shaping her reputation after her death. So let's quickly take a look in her nursery.
Okay.
Her first child, Francis II, as we know, died a year after his succession to king, aged 16. It's said that he died of an ear infection, which was certainly much more dangerous than it is now, but frankly, he'd really never been healthy. He was sickly, physically and psychologically, from the get-go. Her second child, Elizabeth, went on to be the Queen of Spain as the 3rd wife of Philip II. I know, this dude got around. Whose father, Charles, was Henry II's nemesis, but sadly Elizabeth died in childbirth at just 23, so we don't really know how her health would have progressed.
Right.
Her 3rd child, Claude, married the Duke of Lorraine, but also died in childbirth at 27. Her 4th was Charles IX, King of France, for whom Catherine acted as regent for quite a long time. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Charles's fragile mental and physical health weakened quickly. He was probably pretty upset that he'd ordered the murder of his good friend.
Yeah.
He had terrible mood swings and was nearly driven mad by the screams of murdered Huguenots ringing in his ears. He never got over that.
Yikes.
Never super healthy to begin with either, Charles died at age 23 of tuberculosis, coughing up blood and hemorrhaging violently.
Jesus.
And that left Catherine's next son, Henry, to inherit the throne. And actually, Henry already had a throne. Poland's. He won an election just the year before to become the King of Poland. Catherine had actually hoped this would give him status and something to do, but then she regretted it when Charles died a few months later. About a year before his seriously ill brother died, Henry traveled to Poland and took up his new role. But upon receiving word that his brother had died, Henry assured the Polish population that he would be true to them. It's gonna be fine. We're not gonna make any decisions until 6 months from now in September. Everything's gonna be fine. And then he ran away in the middle of the night, taking a lot of the Polish jewels with him, never to return again.
Wow, what a scoundrel.
Just a terrible person.
And he was the favorite.
I don't understand that at all.
It's always the problem children that are the favorite.
It is. That's worrying for the future.
Yeah.
Henry became Henry III, King of France at age 22. And poor Henry had his own set of serious problems. Historians have discussed the possibility of perhaps him being bipolar, but it seems that Henry struggled to align his sexual preferences with his devotion to Catholicism. He had bouts of hedonism, extreme hedonism, real weird stuff. And then that would be followed by extreme pilgrimages and piety, which were devastating to his health. But in the end, it was actually the assassin's knife that took Henry's life 7 months after his mother's death. Yeah. And then there was Margaret, who married Henry of Navarre, whose wedding was so bloody. And Henry of Navarre, Margaret's husband, would become Henry IV of France after inheriting the throne from Margaret's brother, Henry III. Margaret was the only child of Catherine and Henry II who didn't suffer ill health, and she died at 61. Margaret would, at least for a time, rule as the Queen of France, just like her mother. And finally, there was another kid, Francis, the Duke of Anjou, who tried and failed to win Elizabeth I's hand, like many others, and he died of malaria at 29 as the black sheep of the family, and I'm honestly not sure that many people were sad about his death.
Well, my gosh, and with that family, that's saying something, particularly if you're gonna leave your main squeeze Poland in the middle of the night and clear out her silver.
He'd only been there for a few months.
Yeah.
Just enough time to figure out how to unlock the treasury. It's unbelievable.
Timing is impeccable.
Obviously, just looking at this family tree, health was a problem. But modern medicine does have some theories. First is congenital syphilis. As we talked about in episode 1, Catherine's father died of syphilis aged 27, which he got the old-fashioned way. But Catherine did not have any ill health, and so one would expect that if her father's disease had passed to her, she would have been sickly as well. However, a lot of people think it was just one of those weird quirks of fate that had skipped her and then passed down to her children.
In women, syphilis could be a dormant trait that is possible to pass down and have it skip a generation.
So it's unusual, but it does happen. Probably her children inherited congenital syphilis, which would explain their lifelong health problems almost from birth. The other thing is tuberculosis, which was a super common illness at the time, and it carried off many of the victims that were said to be poisoned by her. So between TB and syph, pretty much took care of her whole family.
Yikes.
Basically, every child just had a ticking time bomb that would eventually destroy the entire Valois dynasty.
If anything, you would think that would be the curse of the Medici.
And yet,
It's like Icarus. They rise close to the sun, and then it is just a flaming ball of shit all the way down to the floor.
it is a poop ball to the ground. Flaming poop all the way down. And that is the sad life. sad life of Catherine de Medici. She died at the age of 69, so she lived longer than any of her kids. Likely of pleurisy, which was an inflammation of the lungs, an old person disease, and 69 at the time was old.
Doing good.
Better than the kids. She spent her entire life at war, beginning with the Italian wars that shaped her childhood. Then she was at war with her nemesis Diane de Poitiers, though the two foes did come together to fight off a third front, the possibility of a new and perhaps impregnable wife. And then, after her husband's death, she fought for her son's thrones. And of course, her entire widowhood and the 30 years that she had in power as Dowager Queen were defined by the religious wars of France. I honestly can't think of a more perfect subject for our seasoned women at war. But before we go, let's not forget, and this is a nice little note, that along with the sweet gloves and maybe a few Italian poisons, Catherine also brought the fork to France, which was seen up until that time as pretentious. How dare you eat with a tongue? She also brought artichokes and puff pastry.
Thank God for puff pastries.
She was a foodie queen. She was really into food, and it was actually her influence that made French cuisine into what it is today. So the irony that the French, who despised her Italian paternity, now stake their national culinary reputation on some of her Italian imports is not lost on this chronicler, and it is pretty much the only good thing I can say about her legacy.
Come. I don't know. You did find out that she was not a malicious, nefarious poisoner,
right.
Witch, occultist.
I did the research, and I found that out. But if you're not listening to this podcast, and if you're watching Stars or Sundance or HBO or any of those others, I mean, she looks pretty bad.
She does look pretty bad.
And I don't think she was. And that really, it's very upsetting to me. I spent my whole time being like, leave this woman alone.
Obviously, she was very good at statecraft to hold it together and stay in power as long as she did. But my gosh, you really just want her to be able to give somebody their comeuppance.
You do.
You know?
And I'm intrigued that you say stay in power. And I think that's another misconception. She had no power as Queen of France. Diane de Poitiers had whatever power the wife was going to have. All she had was a womb. When her son Francis came, she was in mourning, and while she was with him, she was not one of his top advisors. That was
because the Guise.
The Guise family took that over. And then, she's regent for 3 years, but she gives up on her own accord. She gives up the regency a year early so that Charles can hopefully unite this very divided France. And then they go on the tour together, but he's 13. Would you let your 13-year-old boy go off for 2 years to just, I don't know, do whatever? That doesn't seem like a great plan.
No, that's not good parenting.
No.
I'll tell you that.
No, that's not great. And then he died 10 years later. He was barely an adult. So, yeah, she was involved with his organization, but he was not married. He did not have a queen. Who's going to perform the queenly functions? Mom.
The dowager.
That's a very natural step. When Henry III takes the throne, it is a little more like you could have just gone off into retirement. But he doesn't get there for 7 months. He takes this long tour from Poland to France, which isn't that far geographically speaking.
No, it's not. But he was taking his daggone time.
And he found more women and men to sleep with, and he had a great promenade through Europe. He gave away money like it was nothing.
Well,
Catherine
was
was like,
nothing. It was the Poland. It was Poland's.
Yeah, and then he gets there, and he has some sort of a psychological break. Yeah, he would just be very involved with men and women of the court to a very physical and violent degree. And then he would go on a 2-month on foot, no shoes pilgrimage to repent. And that's not good for you.
It's not good for your feet.
It is not good for your feet. And someone has to rule while you are gone. And again, no wife. Dowager Queen would be the natural choice to play that queenly role. And she did die before the next one came about. I would be very intrigued to see if she had lived beyond Henry III.
Yeah, what would have happened?
What she would have done when France was in this turmoil of, he's left the throne to a Protestant, what do we do? And the answer was 4 years of war, and then Henry was like, fine, I'll be a Catholic.
Just leave me alone.
Just give me the flippin' throne.
So we've had a little bit of a back and forth now about whether or not she had power or what were her motivations. So what do you think? What was she fighting for, Caroline?
You know what? It feels to me like survival, and that's not fair because she had plenty of money and she had safety in that sense. But she never felt secure because the French never truly trusted her. Even though she had all these friends at court, the French people were like, yeah, she's Italian.
Yeah, we don't care about her.
She's not French. So even though she was the only constant over almost 60 years of this continual change of crowns of the monarchy, she was the only constant. And therefore, she got blamed for a lot of things that just happened because She was the only thing
She
they
was
knew.
there.
She was there. She was visible. They knew who Catherine was. They weren't sure about the new king each time. He was young.
He was a kid, obviously under his mother's thumb.
I think she was fighting for her family.
Rather than survival, could I suggest that maybe she was fighting for stability?
I like that. Stability for her family.
Sure.
And maybe even stability for herself. She never even had any.
That's what I was going to say. So she has no stability. She's orphaned at, 21 days?
Yeah. Then she goes convent
She has
hopping.
been passed around to family, to convents, then to a man who doesn't love her. He dies, and all she's got is her children. I don't even necessarily know that, like you said, power was the end goal. I think it was stability for herself, for her family, for the realm.
Oh, I like that.
I think that was probably what she craved most.
Let's just go beyond that. Is it stability? Or is it love? Is this 21-day orphaned child whose grandmother then died before she was a year and who was taken from the only place where people seemed to like her and then was given to a man who hated her and eventually kind of grew to respect her but never love her, and then she had these children that were so sickly and all she could do was hold on to them for dear life. She really had a very good relationship with all of her children. So was it just that she was fighting for love?
I don't
The
think
love
so.
of the French people?
I think it was stability, because I think she did have that good relationship with her children and wanted her children to have what she could not have. Even if they disagreed, even if they weren't the closest, like for instance with Margot after the massacre, she wanted them to have stability, to have something to come home to, which she never had, and that was a home.
It's just so sad.
It is sad. It is sad. And that, my friends, is that. I wish we could say that we were not going to have a Debbie Downer next week, but strap in, we got another one.
We will see you next week as Mary, Queen of Scots, makes her arrival in France.
Just wait.
Oh.
Just wait.
I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica.
And we are Pithily Yours.
This episode is brought to you by the Pithy Chronicle, LLC. The Pithy Chronicle is intended for education, entertainment, and non-commercial purposes. Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the owner may or may not be associated with in a professional or personal capacity. While we offer lots of sarcasm, this podcast does not offer any advice or services. Listening to this podcast may induce fits of laughter, unexpected distraction, or uncontrollable rage at the subjects, hopefully not at us. We hope you learned something today. If not, so sorry. Please be advised we are not experts in the following fields: medical, legal, financial, technological, thermonuclear engineering, submarine warfare, neuroscience, or cat husbandry. Thanks for listening to our little disclaimer. Just covering our history-loving asses. Bye!